Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Sword Art Online Alicization review. This one's for episode 10, Taboo Index. And it's an interesting episode because I think it is one of the best episodes we have this season. Great cliffhanger ending, and I thought just the way they did the pretty intense, difficult subject matter scenes were very well done. But I think that with this episode there are two things to talk about. One is what actually happened in the episode, and two is, the nature of Sword Art Online tackling some pretty, crazy subject matters like, sexual assault, plus for the first time really having to address the issue of violence and kind of gore with Sword Art Online, because we've had violence before, but because in the Aincrad arc it was all okay, it's in the game, but if someone dies, they die in real life, but their death in game isn't overly gory because of how much of a game it was and the sort of digital blood. Same thing with the GGO arc, but this arc so far has obviously gone down the road of making it pretty clear that it's very realistic. The whole point of the Underworld is that it's meant to be super realistic, and we saw that when Kirito and Yu-Gi-Oh faced the goblins, when they got hurt, and Kirito was shocked by just how real it felt, and that it was basically just like getting hurt in real life. And so when we went into this scene, and I knew what was going to happen, I read this in the light novel, I knew it was going to be pretty violent, and it's going to be one of those kind of tough to watch episodes, and it certainly was. I think they censored it enough to where they didn't just go overboard to make it borderline unwatchable, that they were hiding what was happening from you, but they censored it enough to where it wasn't overly gory, to where I'd say that it's honestly super difficult to watch because it's just troubling. The obviously blood spraying out of arms we got to see, but they did some effects where it was more of a kind of lighting type thing, where they just took some of the color out of those shots to not have it just be really red and focusing in on what's left of their arms and stuff like that. They focused just on the general gist of when these fights came to an end, people were missing arms, there was blood, Rious and Humbert were dying basically, but for the most part I think they did the scene as well as they could. I'm interested to see how they do it on the Blu-ray, in that do they go more uncensored, or do they keep it, to me, in line with the kind of tone of SAO, and maybe just put the kind of lighting back to normal, but not go overboard with showing the kind of brutality of what was happening. The most, censored moment was probably when Kirito's eye pops because he breaks the seal, basically, of being able to break the Taboo Index. That one they just kind of put a shadow down, kind of covering the eye as it happened, but it was still made very, very clear to us what happened. It's not that it was difficult to follow because they didn't show it. They just specifically hid the eye exploding a bit, which it's kind of one of those things where oh god, do I want to watch that happening if they release an uncensored version? I'm not sure. We'll see when we get to it, but those scenes, I think they did it pretty. I think they did it as well as they could, given that it was some of the most intense violence we've seen so far. In that, obviously, I think it was one of those things where, in the situation, you realize that the violence was kind of needed, because, especially until Kirito arrived, it was this kind of complete abuse of noble power, in that until Yu-Gi-Oh unlocked the seal on his eye, he was helpless there. He was frozen, and he almost just had to watch what was just about to happen. And so the violence, when it happened, I think it helped that it was just this kind of finally justice type thing, in that this would be so different if this was one of the heroes kind of getting their arms chopped off. That would be super intense if that were to happen, but like it's a little bit more acceptable, I suppose, because it's the villains and because of just what they've done and the way they've set up these characters as just being completely reprehensible. So there's that. That's the violence, I suppose. I didn't mind it too much. I'm interested to see where this kind of falls on the kind of censored or not scale. As for, I suppose, the other topic here, which they actually put up a warning before the episode, at least on the version of the episode that I watched, which was basically a warning that there is basically a depiction of sexual assault. I felt like, given that this was something that I knew was happening, I knew going in this was the episode when it was going to happen, I think they did this as well as they could without, I suppose, emphasizing the kind of sexual part of sexual assault. They focused more on the fact that this is an assault, and they didn't try to in any way kind of show you stuff here, really. They made it clear that, look, this is what is going to happen if something doesn't come to stop them, but they didn't go overboard and do more than I felt that they needed to. They got across the intensity of the scene and made you want Yujiro to do anything he could to stop this from happening. And look, as I said, like, it was tough to watch because even though you don't know Ronnie and TS that much, especially like TS from like the last episode, like you really care for the character and you don't want this to happen to her, so you want her to be saved. They did that well, and given that like it's obviously difficult for, like, especially in anime where there's at times when it comes to sexual stuff in anime, like very the reputation, I suppose, isn't exactly there for like it's going to be treated with the best like respect, but I think it was well done here, and I will praise this the animators, the writers, and so on for this episode, because they did this and I felt like that was done how I think it needed to be done, given that that's where the plot went, and in that sense, like, they emphasized the violence more so than the kind of sexual assault kind of stuff, and I think it helped to just get across how intense, how wrong what was happening here was, and that's why, like, a lot of the plot points of just the significance of Yujiro unlocking the seal on his right eye, breaking through the system error, and now basically he is an AI in the way that the makers of this game want the AIs to be. He is an ALICE. He basically has free will now and is, in essence, an artificial human. He's broken through the main barrier that most people in the underworld have to, I suppose, with regards to them not being officially labeled as like a full-on bottom-up AI. And that's what Yujiro is now. And I thought it was very significant that Kirito specifically mentioned the term human to him multiple times, trying to, I suppose, console him in the aftermath. Similarly, I like that Miss Azalea came up to him afterwards, and the way she handled this, I think, without them going into a lot of like explaining the nature of what happened, they made it clear enough that I think she knew what happened here, and she wasn't really going to condemn them for doing what they did to save TS and Ronnie from what was happening, plus what like Humbert and Rious were doing with their own pages. So I like that, and I like that she demonstrated this sort of more like veteran character nature in terms of what some of the stuff that she did afterwards. One, having the ability of like to do a system command to generate a new eye for Yujiro, and then secondly, mentioning to him specifically, you've done something that I've never been able to do, and break that seal. Just the fact that she knows that there's a seal, that she's tried to purposefully, I suppose, have more free will, break one of the laws that she feels that shouldn't be there, and she hasn't been able to break that seal. It gets across that it's so locked into this world that it is a incredibly difficult thing to do, and that's why it is such an intense kind of thing that happens when you finally break it. Like, you do have to destroy your eye, basically. And you saw like Yu-Gi-Oh's eye twitching just before it was happening as well. And just the physical impact that the way the laws are kind of incorporated into this world is very interesting in how they do it, and that Yu-Gi-Oh is literally frozen in place because, as a noble, like Rious and Humbert feel that they are so above everyone else that they can basically almost manipulate the laws to their advantage and like almost like command them to do what they want. That because as nobles they have the most ability to, I suppose, flaunt the laws. They have they feel they have a certain control over it, and so they kind of do. It was so interesting to see, like, I think Rious just put his hand up and be like, stop, as Yu-Gi-Oh begins to come over to him. You're breaking a law here if you come over and, like, fight me over this. And then the, like, justification that he gives for, I suppose, why there's no taboo index, like, stopping him and Humbert from doing what they're about to do, which, like, is one of those things where, like, surely what they're doing is a breach of the taboo index, but because of the whole nobility thing, because of the excuse they basically give of, like, well, they are trying to, like, defame us by coming over here. They're lower ranked nobles, and they're trying to sort of ask us to do something as higher ranked nobles that is against, like, our laws, so, you know, it is within our noble right to kind of dispense punishment to them by the normal taboo index. And, you know, it's a kind of complicated explanation, but I like that they went in depth into, I suppose, explaining why this is allowed to happen and the sort of injustice that you can have, basically, based on the fact that, you know, of course our hero characters are going to use their willpower and their drive to empower their swords and, you know, break the laws of the game, but the villain characters are able to do it as well, and this just got across a very villainous nature of what they're able to do. And yeah, it was this just super violent and intense scene that is just brutal because, like, it's this sexual assault scene, but then just as they're basically saved, they're saved by the fact that they have, like, blood sprayed all over them and, like, there's arms being cut off, that they have to go through this incredibly crazy situation to get out of this. And you wonder what their mental state is going to be like in the aftermath of this. Now, of course, you know that they're strong characters because they're high enough in the school to be, like, elite pages of elite disciples. So, you know, TS and Ronnie are, you know, stronger than perhaps, you know, you would think they've been presented, given that we haven't seen them fight yet. But still, you know, just the fact that they have been saved here before anything really, really bad happens, but it's always this kind of terrible, like, memory that they have. And yeah, that's where a lot of the fighting, the violence happens. The only proper fight bit that we actually get is a brief clash of swords between Rious and Kirito, which basically just results in like a 2-hit exchange. They do one sword skill at each other. Kirito's kind of forced back a little bit, but then transitions into a combo skill and chops his arms off. The other significant thing here is obviously the death of Rious, and I suppose the nature of how it happened, in that he didn't just die from bleeding out from blood loss or, like, his health going down. They specifically note that something happened with his Fluchtlight, that he started kind of obviously freaking out, of course, because of what was happening to him, but then he basically started, like, glitching, that it suddenly became clear that, oh, they're in a game, so if there's an error, you do get that sort of kind of computer kind of error kind of stuff happening. And so he started sort of, like, phasing out and back in and kind of juttering all over the place. And the way they kind of, I suppose, with the sound effects did his death, it was like a computer, like, just dying, that like the AI program, in a way, that is Rious, just kind of ended like that he just, like, fried himself because of what was happening. And they made it kind of clear that his death was more caused by just, I suppose, the contradictions of what he was doing, more so than the physical injuries that he was suffering from. It obviously all compounded together, but they were trying to make it clear that there was this distinction they were making here of, like, in the end, he kind of was breaking a taboo index, and because breaking a taboo index does put a strain on your body, it was this situation of he was already losing blood because his arms were cut off, and it was like the stress of coming this close to breaking a rule himself was what killed him. And it was like he sort of in the end realized like all of the rules he had broken, and here he is, I suppose, officially breaking a rule here, trying to steal life from Humbert. So that was it. And it was this interesting scene where like it was pretty brutal just to see that like here's this character, you know, even though he, as villainous as he is, what he was about to do was terrible. Rious died on screen, and it was really, really brutal. And it was this kind of important kind of plot point that kind of Kirito now has in his mind of, you know, that I suppose your interaction with the rules is more significant than they think. Just the fact that like breaking the rule kind of destroys your eye, but it's really difficult to do. In that Yu-Gi-Oh was sort of out of the fight, and almost in the aftermath of this, there was the initial adrenaline of delivering that first strike, but in the aftermath, he was just like recovering from what happened. Like, yes, missing an eye, but also he seemed just like drained of energy. How much energy it took just to break that seal. And then yeah, the ending scene, like we obviously get the Mrs. Elia bit, they're being taken away, but Alice is the one who's going to take them back to the capital. I thought that was a really, like, just hugely significant moment in that it changes, I suppose, the nature of the story. The journey goes from being this kind of very kind of well plotted, like progress through this tournament, advance through the school, become the top pupils at the school, win the next tournament, become Integrity Knights, get to the capital, and somehow find a way to get Alice back. And then all of a sudden, along the way, they get into this incident. Suddenly they're being taken to the capital as criminals, quote unquote, and the person who's taking them there is the person that they're going to the capital to find in the first place. And suddenly everything changes now, because now the question is that they know where Alice is. They've met her. She doesn't recognize them. Now, she for the same reason as Yu-Gi-Oh, wouldn't recognize Kirito, because the memories of Kirito's first experience in the game, basically his second childhood, is kind of missing. So it's basically, instead of a trio from their childhood, it's just this kind of duo that Yu-Gi-Oh and Alice should recognize each other, and Yu-Gi-Oh recognizes her, but she doesn't seem to recognize him. And I think that's a very significant plot point, in addition to the fact that she calls herself Alice Synthesis 30. So she's an Integrity Knight. We had that same naming convention when Alice was taken away, and we're going to find out what that exactly means. Clearly there's been some sort of like brainwashing just with the fact that she doesn't remember Yu-Gi-Oh, and we'll see what happens next. I think they've set up this huge kind of crazy thing like that you're so distracted by just the violence and brutal nature of what's just taking place, and then all of a sudden the plot goes in this completely different direction. So there's this, I think there's something just so amazing about this episode and what it was able to do. So I think that's most of what I want to talk about here. I think it's a very discussion worthy episode, but I will praise the show for how it handled these sort of difficult subject matters that it dealt with here. In the grand scheme of things, they probably did a sexual assault kind of scene as best as they could. And then when it comes to violence, given that Sword Art Online hasn't been like overly violent in its run so far, the sudden introduction of pretty heavy violence was fairly well done. But again, I do want to see what they do with regards to how censored it was, or because of this type of show that it is, and it's still pretty mainstream and not just like a niche show where they can maybe go down a more violent path. I'm interested to see, did they purposefully like not go overboard with the violence because they know SAO is one of the more popular anime out there. So they're my thoughts on the episode. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on this one. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.